Okay, so we're going to be editing a photo that I took probably 4 years ago, 3 years ago, and this one was in Alabama Hills. So right here, I'm just kind of zooming in, checking out the image, seeing maybe what it needs, kind of having it tell me, yeah, exactly where I need to go with it. And so I changed the background to white because white is a good one to see the light. I should have left it black because right now I'm doing white balance and a black background is best for color. Just kind of helps be less distracting. But as you could see, I did vibrance and saturation up to 100. It really helps you see all of the colors within your photo and really helps you dial it in. So once I dial that part in, I reset those to 0, dial it in just a little bit more, and then we switch over to black and white. I like going contrast down here at the start. What I'm trying to do here, you can see that with my histogram, I'm kind of balancing the entire thing. This is what I use the basic panel for. We're not trying to make the photo look good at this point. We're just trying to set it up to be able to dial everything in with our tone curve and make it as easy as possible to get the whole spectrum of light that we're going to want. Right here, this is if you hold down the option key. Yeah, you can see exactly what's all the way black or even what's all the way white. Of course, we can also look at our histogram, but it's just a good visual. So once I do that, switch back to color for just a sec, just to be able to see, and then back to black and white for our tone curve. Yeah, you can see I left the background white again. That's just a matter of me forgetting to turn it back to black. So right here, using the tone curve, I really like to use that, I don't know what it's called, but just that little point thing, so that way you can click and drag on your image. The first one that I try to find is a good mid-tone, so I'm going to do something right around my subject, and then next I select a darker tone and drag that one down. This just bringing our contrast back into our image. Right there, I kept messing up and accidentally clicking stuff, so I had to reset that, but now I'm zooming in, finding a really dark point. This is what I do to be able to add a sharp contrast to it. So you can see how it really just helps sharpen things up and define what we want to define there. So now here again, I'm just messing up a little bit. So I just grab that dot with there, bring it up just a little bit. Looks like I wanted it just a little bit brighter. Yeah, and by the way, I've already done this, so I'm just doing a voiceover here, just kind of explaining what exactly is happening. So right here, I'm finding a lighter tone, and yeah, I'll be able to dial that one in here. So here we go. As you'll see, a lot of times I go up, down, and then I dial it in. This just helps you see kind of the range of what's possible with what we're doing there. And now again, I'm kind of doing a sharper contrast type of thing there. So dragged it up a little bit because I wanted the sky on the right side close to my sun just to be a little bit brighter. You can see on my sky it is pretty blown out here, but we're going to fix that just a little bit later. Right here I go to lens corrections, but this was back when I was using manual lenses, so I just had an adapter on, no electronics in there, so yeah, I has no idea what lens I was using for this. So I just kind of skipped it because honestly, lens corrections don't matter too much. If you're using cheaper lenses, anything like that, it would matter. But overall, you don't need to focus on it. So here we're doing the detail, so sharpening, noise reduction. And you can see with the masking, again, I held down option. That helps you see what exactly is going to be sharpened. I bumped the sharpening up, moved my radius all the way right, all the way left. And now I'm just kind of moving it up until it starts to catch. I don't want to do it too high because that's going to make just the edges a little bit oddly pixelated. And now I'm doing detail, again, slider all the way up, slider all the way down. We need to see the full range of what's possible here in order to know where it needs to go. So next up, calibration. Right here I'm noticing really just a little bit of magenta. There you can see I turned it to black because I noticed I couldn't see my colors well enough. Yeah, I'm going to end up putting this just a little bit towards green. You can see that I reset it there after I saw my full spectrum of what was possible. So we go a little towards green just to get rid of a little bit of that magenta in our shadows. Now again, you can see left, right, back to center, and now we dial it right into what we need it at. Here we go again, right, left, back to center. Dial it in. I usually go up with green primary, down with blue primary, and then red primary. It can really go either direction. So yeah, it looks like we're going a little bit up here, a little bit more towards orange. So next we go HSL. I always do luminance first because illuminance is going to be the easiest way to see where the colors are hitting. A lot of times you'll actually look at a color in here, and most common is going to be our greens and yellows. You see a green, and so you drag your green slider, but the fact is it's usually not actually green. It's usually actually the yellows that are going to affect that one. So yellow luminance goes up a bit. Green luminance wasn't affected much, but I pulled it down just a tiny bit because the greens happen more in the shadows, is where the true greens are. The aquas, there wasn't much, so I just lowered that a little bit. And then the blues, there was a good amount of, so I lowered that in order to really define that line. You can see how I moved my cursor there just to kind of show exactly what I was seeing. Now, purples and magentas, I could see it wasn't changing much, so I left those alone. If I don't see it changing much, I'll leave it alone. Otherwise, sometimes it'll cause a little bit of banding that you might not notice until later in your edit. So next up is hue. So now we're just dialing that in. I zoom into my subject. I find that hue is a lot easier to dial in when you're zoomed in, just because we know what colors things should be. And so yeah, way better to zoom in for that one. So I'm just kind of going around, finding my different colors, zooming in or out to a point where I can see enough of the image, not only to see what color something should be, but also how those colors are interacting with the surrounding colors. So we zoom out here because there's, our greens are mainly in the bottom, and so I zoom out a bit so that way I can see how it's all blending together overall. I'm trying to make sure that I'm not getting like a color cast there. Again, you can also see, all the way left, all the way right. We want to see what is possible with that slider. I don't think it matters how good you are at editing. Every single photo will edit differently. Sometimes you have to bump things up or down a lot, sometimes just a little. So always drag those sliders all the way up, all the way down, back to center, and dial it in. And yeah, again, I didn't touch my purples or magentas because I didn't see them in the photo in the first place, so therefore we do not need to dial in the saturation or the hue of those. So next up, we are using color grading. So I always go saturation 50, and then I do a warm tone, kind of a sunlight tone in my midtones. Next, saturation 50 for our shadows, and I'll do a cooler tone, so that would be green or blue typically. I usually do green though, because if you're in a landscape, you're going to have plants, and I noticed that green just really helps that out. And also a lot of times in shadows, you'll get a little bit more magenta, so we just want to cancel that out a bit. Now for highlights, a lot of times people are going to think, oh, highlights, that's like what the sun's hitting, so therefore it should be warm. I actually do cyan because when you go outside and you look at a highlight, the sun, it almost kind of blows it out a bit and makes it almost more white. And one thing I noticed is in order to make something appear more white, you should, stumbling over my words, but you should add a little bit of cyan. So now with saturation still at 50 on all three of those, I'm doing my balance and blending. Did less blending because I like the separation. So now I'm going resetting all of those down to 0. Now I'll go back to my midtones here and dial that saturation up until it's looking good. Again, I go up, down, and then I dial it in. Okay, so now for shadows, up, down. Right here, I'm just trying to essentially cancel out the magentas in our shadows. If you look outside, shadows really don't have as much colors as midtones and highlights out in the real world, so I usually really just try to cancel things out to bring it to more of a gray. We'll also see something that I do a little bit later that's going to achieve the same thing. And in this one, highlight, since we've got that lovely sun ray going through, not going to do much cyan in there, but just enough to kind of crisp it up just a little bit. So right here I am selecting my sky because as I blew it out earlier, I need to fix that one now. Not sure why I paused there, but I was probably, I don't know, texting my wife or something. Oh, you know what? No, it's that little menu thing where you can see all of your different masks, and it disappeared on me, and I could not figure out where it went, so I was trying a whole bunch of stuff to get it back there. um, I ended up figuring it out eventually, but you know, give me just a sec and then you'll see that I figured it out. I just kind of went with it on this one a little bit though. So darken my sky. I'm pretty sure I ended up adding contrast here just because in the top left corner versus the bottom right corner of the sky, I wanted to make sure that there was some good contrast. So now my whites I ended up dropping a bit. So now you can see how I zoom out this much. That is because one, when we're viewing this on a phone, that's about how small it's going to be. But two, you can really see how all of the tones interact when you make it that small. So that way you get a really good idea of your like the overall luminance in your image. Right here I'm trying to figure out where the hell that panel went again. So like kind of going through things, being like, did I uncheck something? Did I hit an accidental keyboard shortcut? I had no idea. I can't even remember how I got it back, but you know, let's keep watching and see. Take a sip of coffee while I figure this one out. So hopefully I don't make too big of a slurping noise on my mic. And that was annoying. I was so confused. I hate when that happens. Sometimes you'll push a key and all of a sudden something hugely like important just disappears. So right here, oh, what is happening? Oh, sorry, my something just happened here. I don't really know what's going on with my computer. Why is it like trying to shut down? Okay, there we go. Now I'm back in Premiere. What the heck, dude? Cancel, save. Okay, sorry guys, this is being super funky on me. Okay. Yeah, so now I'm turning the temperature more towards blue. When I go more towards blue, I also add in a little bit of green because blue plus green equals more of a cyan color. If you haven't noticed, I love the cyan color. So now right here, one thing that I noticed is I'm zooming in here because you can see that little line right between the sky and the mountains, and I noticed that it was getting dark, so that's why I'm raising my blacks and raising my shadows. I'm just trying to get it so that way it's not hitting that line quite as much. Now I'm experimenting with dehaze. I like to touch a lot of sliders because again, no matter how good you are, every photo will edit different, and so don't act like you're a little pro and like you can predict what every slider is going to do, because the fact is you can't predict that. So don't pretend like you can. Experiment, act like you're a beginner, act like you're still learning, because we're all still learning. We can always get better. Always keep that one in mind. Okay, so now I'm trying to figure out where that panel went again because I'm about done with my sky, and I've got a few more masks to make here. So I ended up closing that panel, and that's what brought it back for me. And I was super confused as to why it disappeared in the first place, but I was just kind of like, oh well, it's back now, so I'll forget about it. So now right now we can see that little ray of sunlight here, and that is where our subject is. It's two of my friends who are hiking. And so right here I'm going to be brightening up that little sun streak. I'm pulling it to the left to get it away from where the horizon line is between the land, more, I guess you could call that more in the foreground, versus the mountain in the background. So now I was trying to pan down, but my computer was being weird. My computer's been abused, so it gives me issues while I'm editing, but that's why I usually don't do slow videos like this. I'll do time lapses because you can't see me having all the issues that I have. So now, again, drag the slider up, down, back to center, dial it in, just kind of figuring out where exactly all my different tones are. Of course, I can get a good general idea. The left side of the histogram is kind of the area that I'm editing right now, but also that shorter part more in the middle left of the histogram, that's where the light is on them. I noticed it was a little bit desaturated, so I wanted to add a little bit of saturation, because saturation is one of those things that will help draw your viewer's eye over to, you know, where you want them to look. So in this case, I want people to notice the hikers, so I'm going to up saturation. Now with brightening that and all of that, it was kind of lightening my shadows too much, so I just added some contrast because I wanted the lights, but I also wanted to deepen the darks a bit. And now right now I'm doing another little mask here, so that way I can bring just the exact point where they are out, kind of separate them against the rocks and make something that's going to catch our viewer's eye right here. So yeah, just going up a little with the whites, lower contrast, just some things like that make it pretty easy to recognize that those are people. So now I'm painting out some of the dark spots under, because otherwise it will look unnatural. So yep, dialing it in still. Yeah, little tiny movements here. Don't want to overdo it. Okay, so now I'm zooming out again, because again I want to get a good idea of where my tones are. So right here, linear gradient, I'm putting that right on where the bottom of that line of, like the bottom of the sun ray there, and now I'm subtracting the sky from that, and so that way I can just focus on that sun ray, because our sun ray, we're not going to see it on the sky, but we are going to see it on where it overlaps our environment. So I'm brightening it up a bit, I'm adding warmth, really trying to make it just like this warm sun that is setting above us, because that's, you know, really what it is. Whenever I'm doing adjustments with sun, I'll always do the dehaze down, because, you know, when you think of it, if you have, you know, a foggy day, you might want to do the dehaze up a bit, bring out the contrast. But if you go and look outside, when the sun crosses something, you'll see that the contrast goes down, and all four things of contrast is contrast, texture, clarity, and dehaze. It's really good to think of those all as contrast, because even texture, that one is a kind of micro detail fine contrast. Clarity is kind of a sharp hard contrast. Dehaze is more of a deep contrast, and the actual contrast slider is just an even contrast. So remember that all of those are forms of contrast. Right now, right here, I'm just trying to see if maybe blurring that spot a bit will help, but it looked unnatural, so I reset that one there. So now pushing the backslash key, that's what will show you your original image. Do this a lot throughout your photo, because it's really easy to over edit a photo. So by toggling back and forth between your raw image and where you are currently in your edit, it's going to help show you if you're over editing, under editing, or maybe your colors are off. When we stare at our screen, our eyes are going to get used to how our image looks when it's in front of us, and so we want to be able to bring ourselves back to square one, and so that way we can really notice if we're messing something up. So now right here I'm just painting a little bit of the light out of a few areas, just because when the sun hits, it's not necessarily going to lighten the background all the way through. So some of our more shadowed areas I'm painting out. Let's see, changing the flow as I go, because sometimes when it's on that harsher line, sorry, I was thinking feather right there. Yeah, the flow, sometimes we want it at 100, sometimes we want it low though, if we're just trying to take a little bit out. So now right here I'm doing a gradient. It's gonna, whoa, it's gonna go up a little bit right there. This one I'm just kind of lightening that whole foreground area. I like doing it pretty smooth, so almost every gradient I'll drag a good ways off of my image. Sometimes I even have to zoom out just for how far I drag it off. And now I'm subtracting with a brush, because I want to take this off of my background. And I'm screen recording here, and so my computer's running a little slow, so it's not necessarily showing me what I'm doing as I do it. I just kind of have to assume what exactly I'm doing. Since I'm painting out 100% of the light that's not on this foreground landscape, I can just keep painting, because I know that I want zero, like none of that, to be touching back there. that's kind of what I'm doing here, changing my brush size. I'm doing a lot of feather on that because I don't want to be able to see necessarily a harsh line. Right here I do exposure to 0 because it kind of helps me see, again, where things are hitting. Then I reset it there because I accidentally put it plus 0.07, and when you have any adjustment there, it's not going to show that red overlay. I like that when I'm painting. You got to see what's selected and what's not. Where else do you need to touch up? That's right here, still doing that, kind of with a small brush, do more finer details, corners, things like that. You don't want to paint too much out there or miss too much. Okay, so now for foregrounds, I'll a lot of times lower the contrast a good amount, just kind of yeah, bring all of those tones in there closer together. This just kind of helps make it a little easier to look at and a little more pleasing, a little less distracting, because contrast is another way that we can guide our viewers' eyes through our image. So if we have more of a contrasty background, maybe we'll want a less contrasty foreground, because that's going to be easier to look at. And also, there's generally some sunlight there, so I didn't want too dark of darks, but I'm still, see right here, I'm lowering my blacks and I'm looking at my histogram, making it so that way my blacks are just barely touching the left side, because I know that all of my blackest blacks are up here in the foreground landscape. It's not like a typical foreground where you throw like a tree branch or leaf or grass or bush or whatever, whatever you're putting in your foreground there, but yeah, dialing it in a bit, moving contrast. Remember, after you touch a slider, you can always go back and touch it again. So right here, I'm kind of looking through a couple of these here, just trying to make sure that everything's matching up. I notice this trail here, of course, since it is dirt, it's going to be catching a little bit of light, so I'm trying to paint in just a little bit of light on that trail. Again, just to make it look natural again. If we keep everything too dark, it's not going to look amazing. Right there, I accidentally grabbed the little thing, so I had to Command Z to get rid of that. But yeah, here I am. Yeah, adding a little bit of light in there again, just since a trail, that one has lighter dirt, so therefore it's going to catch the light from the sky, just a little bit of that like ambient light hitting it. So that's why I'm brightening that here. Got to keep things looking natural enough. It's all about those little details that really sets a good image apart from a bad image, or rather a good edit apart from a bad edit. Okay, yeah, so looks like I'm done with that there, toggling back and forth. I believe that right here at this point I noticed that the top of the mountain, it's a little bit too bright where it's looking kind of unrealistic, so darkening that one. A lot of times these sun rays actually will be just a little bit darker. Yeah, so just kind of dialing that one in there. Again, you zoom out so that way you can see how everything in the image is interacting. Make sure that everything looks good together. I don't want my sun ray too bright, and I also don't want it too dark. We're trying to keep things realistic, but kind of dreamy. Obviously, you're never going to go out and see something look exactly like this, but this is just my style. I really enjoy it when it has that sort of vibe to it. So now I'm hitting my sky again. I'm making it just a little bit darker. Even the wider part of the sky, when you really look at the sky, the only thing that's going to be pure white in real life is going to be if you're staring like directly at the sun. And so we really don't want our histogram clipping all the way to our whites, because in my opinion, there's rarely almost anything out here in our natural world that is going to be pure white. Even if you have, let's say, a white car, it's actually just a really, really light gray. Because once you hit white, I mean, it doesn't have any detail, and we all know that the side of a white car does have a little bit of detail still. Now, after I've gone through all of that, vibrance and saturation back to 100, I'm just kind of dialing in the white balance right here. I always like to go back through, kind of edit the colors again, make sure everything is looking good. You might have noticed earlier with calibration, I didn't touch the saturation sliders, and that's because I wanted to go through the edit a little bit more before I touched that. So you'll see me go back to that here in a sec. Right here is another trick I use: vibrance down to 0, and then you bring the saturation up until it starts catching the color. And what I mean by catching is you bring it up and it slowly increases the color, and then at a certain point it really starts increasing the color and ramping up. And so right at that point where it starts ramping is where I'll leave it, and then I drag the vibrance up until the image looks good. From there, that really, again, just gives you a starting point for you to dial in more. So now we're going back to calibration. Move the slider way right, way left. See the full range of what it's going to do. Double click, bring it back to center in a sec here. Again, my computer is going slow because I'm screen recording, so I had to wait for it for just a sec. So left and right. Really see the full range of what is possible here. And blue primary, all the way left, all the way right. You're going to see in a sec. I guess I'll just talk about it now because I'll still be talking about it when it happens, but I usually do the saturation on blue primary down, green primary up, and then again red can either go up or down. Every photo is different, so just kind of make your own judgment there. Whatever looks good to you, whatever makes you look happy, I would say is correct. So, you know, make your image super saturated, make it super desaturated, whatever makes you happy. That's kind of why we do photography. We shouldn't be doing it for anyone other than ourselves, so don't mind the judgment if anyone tries to judge you there. So now right here I'm selecting those blue tones in the middle, and that's with the color range selection. Now I'm doing a linear gradient to deselect kind of that sunray area, and now another subtract radial gradient to deselect this lower area. I'm making this one a bit more feathered, kind of all the way up that, because I don't really care to paint that part out. You know, if I was planning on printing this photo super big, I might do that, but in that case, I'd also probably edit it in Photoshop just because it has a lot more power and you can be a lot more accurate with it. So now I'm checking out the hue, seeing what it looks like throughout its range, just that way I can really figure out what do I want to do here. So yeah, it looks like I'm going just a tiny bit up with it, and that's to make it almost a bit more blue rather than purple. Adding a little bit of warmth to it here, because it was just too blue. Like, you know, we've got good contrast in real life, but we don't have blues that are that deep a lot of the time. I mean, you know, sometimes we do, but make your own judgment there again. So I'm making just a little bit of warmth because that ambient light from the sun, since the sun's not directly hitting it, that light actually would be a little bit warmer, so that's why I was adding that in there. Back to basic panel, gonna touch up vibrant saturation again. You can see I bounce around all of the panels depending on what I'm seeing. So now right here I was noticing my foreground, it's looking a little bit too green, and as you can see when I use that selection tool it selected yellow because, like I said earlier, greens are usually yellow in reality. So now I'm just kind of trying to think, what do I want to do next? Couldn't get my colors where I wanted them with the other color tools that we have, so I'm going to use the tone curve. First of all, doing the greens and magentas, because those were the main colors that I noticed that I wasn't loving. Was, you know, some greens in certain places, some magentas in other places. Right here, adding a little bit of magenta to that warm light, because magenta is a warm tone and green is a cool tone. So now right here I believe I'm adding almost a little bit of what was it? What did I do here? Okay, yeah, so a little bit more blue to our shadows, which you can see almost made it look a little more gray rather than blue, just because it was a little bit warmer before. And we add a little bit of warmth to our sunlight, and then a little bit of blue to our foreground, because our shadows down there were a little bit darker than I wanted them. And then you can see up here, I'm actually just dragging that very top point where our whites are down a little bit, and so that way our sun on that side is warm. Of course, that made the left side of our sky a little like green, because, you know, blue plus yellow equals green. So we're going to make that a little bit more blue again. always want to have good color contrast in our photos. Color contrast, in my opinion, it almost matters more than like a luminance contrast. That was, I feel like, one of the really important things that I learned while I was figuring out how to edit was that if you have good contrast in your photo, when it's, let's say, black and white, once you turn it to color, if you don't have good color contrast, it's going to look awful still, and you're not totally going to know why. It's going to almost look like there's a bit of a haze over your photos, how I usually say it. A lot of times we'll have a bit of like a yellow haze or maybe a green haze. And that's one reason why I usually subtract the yellow saturation from my photo a little bit. It just helps it look a little bit cleaner from what I've noticed. So again, since we're doing color, I noticed, okay, I'm not seeing my colors well enough here, so I changed the background back to black, just that way I could pay attention to the colors a little bit more. And now I'm going back to my masks. I noticed something that I wanted to do here. Let's see what it was. Oh, I know what I'm doing here. Okay, so saturation again. When I observe our natural world, I see that shadows usually don't have as much saturation as midtones and highlights, kind of like I was saying earlier. So I'm doing a luminance range so that it'll mainly select just my shadows. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull some of the saturation out of it. And again, this is for that kind of color haze that goes over our photo. This is just to clean up our color, take it out of where we don't want it, and leave it in where we do want it. Again, all the way left, all the way right, see how exactly it's going to affect, see where in our image it's going to affect as well. I'm leaving that one pretty low because I want a lot of that saturation out of there. And done with that part. Back to basic panel. I believe I'm going to just kind of touch up luminance here again. Okay, yeah, this looks like I'm zooming in. I like to zoom in a lot and just kind of scan my image, see if I notice anything as I zoom in. Zooming out is really important to make sure that all of your colors and tones are mixing well throughout the full photo. But when you zoom in, that's when you're looking for things that you would notice in reality. Is there any weird contrast? I'm noticing in the sunlight a bit there. I don't necessarily love how the bushes are looking, so I believe I did something with that just a little bit. Also on this left side, I thought that the light looked just a little bit unnatural, so you can see I'm going to do a subtract brush here from that layer that where I added in the sunlight. Okay, so yeah, you can see my flow is a little bit lower, so that way I'm not going to overdo this part. Taking a little bit out of there just because when sunlight goes in a ray, sure it is going in a straight line, but as you get depth in there and layers, it's going to go maybe in a slightly shifted line where one of the lines will be slightly above or below that main line of sunlight. So right here I'm just kind of painting it out of some of those shadowed areas. And then you're going to notice in a sec here I'm actually going to paint just a little tiny bit of it back in because I overdid it. Again, computer's a little bit slow, so I can't always see this part in real time as I'm brushing. My computer used to be able to do that, but mid 2015 MacBook Pro that lived in a car with me for a few years, it's been used, it's been abused, it's been overheated, my battery is not doing well, the thing has to be plugged in, otherwise it'll turn off even at 100% battery. It's kind of ridiculous, but it works out. It still edits. That's right here, I'm adding just a little bit of sunlight back in. You can see that I put the feather kind of low on that just because the beam of sun going through there is usually going to be a harsh light unless it's being diffused by clouds. Here in this part of California, there's usually a slight haze in the sky. I think it's just kind of moisture gathering around and above the mountains, and so I still want a little bit of feather on that because it's still being diffused just a tiny bit, but it is still a pretty harsh line there. Okay, yeah, so that's looking a little better. You can just see on the left side it almost looks just a little more natural with the sun not being exactly in a straight line. So I'm just going to dial in my light one more time. You have to be kind of careful with this because since we are utilizing the tone curve, as we change the light on our basic panel, it's going to change how the tone curve is actually affecting our image. So be careful with this one. You can also see how I turned the background back to white, because when it was black, yeah, the image looked good, but now that it's white again, we can see our image might actually be just a little dark. And so that's where I thought it looked good. It's loading for just a sec as I go full screen, but this is, I'm pretty sure, what I ended up with here. I don't think I made any more changes, but this was kind of the image that I was happy with. I like it. It's a little lower contrast. You can see the two people hiking pretty well. You don't really have too much black in your image. You don't have too much white. I definitely enjoyed how it looked. There's the before, there's the after. Before and after again, just so that way you guys can see the difference. And I also just do that, and so that way I can, again, see if I over edited.